It's my pleasure to chair the next panel. The first presenter is Jacqueline Ristola. Jacqueline is a PhD candidate in film and moving image studies at the Mel Hoppenheim School of Cinema at Concordia University. Her research interests include political economy and labor studies in the culture industries and transnational cultural flows, particularly as they manifest in television animation production. All right, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to the organizers, this conference has been very sort of inspiring and I've been learning a lot. So thanks again. So how many people here know or have seen Steven Universe? I'm sort of surprised. I'm not surprised everyone's hands rose. But anyway, so just a brief overview then. Steven Universe is an animated television series created by Rebecca Sugar for Cartoon Network. It's about a young boy, the titular Steven Universe, who lives with the crystal gems, inorganic humanoid aliens named Garnet, Amethyst, and Pearl, also seen here in the poster. And they need to come together as the crystal gems to protect Earth from Gems, the home planet, a colonizing force known as Homeworld. The series began in 2013 and just wrapped up its 5th season and its main story arc a few months ago. It has a TV movie scheduled for the fall. It just won awards from GLAAD and the Peabody Awards. I think it's also won some Emmys for its excellence in children's television. It's also really critically acclaimed for its queer representation as well. So while Steven Universe draws from many anime series and films for inspiration, the influence of the works of anime director Kunihiko Ikuhara perhaps runs the deepest. In particular, Steven Universe derives many of its themes and motifs from 2 series that Ikuhara has worked on, Sailor Moon from 1992 to 1997, that's when he was the director, and then Revolutionary Girl Utena from 1997, and that he was the main creative force behind that series. So as this paper I'm presenting today is a shortened version of a forthcoming book chapter, this paper is just going to focus on Revolutionary Girl Utena and a select topics, visual iconography, queer representation and embodiment, and fandom to illustrate the impact of anime's transnational circulation and consumption on Steven Universe, and in particular, its representation, queer representation. So female-female love is central to much of Kunihiko Ikuhara's work, and this runs from Revolutionary Girl Utena's symbolic dismantling of patriarchy to his more recent work Yuikuma Arashi from 2015 and its critiques of lesbian stereotypes perpetuated in Japanese media. Steven Universe draws heavily from Ikuhara's depiction of queer love and expression, be it through visual or thematic motifs. And so just briefly, I want to go through some of these visual influences that Utena has on Steven Universe. So roses are prominent yonic imagery throughout each series. This is from the opening sequence of Revolutionary Girl Utena. In Steven Universe is even a character named Rose Quartz. Roses are sort of seen throughout this series as also serve a symbol of her presence. Another key motif in both series is swords, and specifically swords and other weapons being pulled from the body. So there's this blurring between organic and inorganic matter happening, which is really interesting and sort of cyborgian. And we see this really directly referenced in Steven Universe. Steven's pulling a rose-encrusted sword from the head of a lion. That lion's name is Lion. And then finally, there are also these specific shots in Steven Universe that are, this direct reference to Revolutionary Girl Utena. So I wanted to illustrate some of these briefly because while my presentation is going to be talking more about systems of performativity and gender performativity, I wanted to emphasize that the queer influences here are not just narrative or just thematic, but it's also visual. It's also in terms of the aesthetics of the production of these series. So what requires a bit more unpacking then are the certain forms of performative acts that Steven Universe borrows from Revolutionary Girl Utena, and also how it builds off of these kinds of performative acts and how they both serve as sort of the foundation for their understanding of queerness and gender performativity. So for Utena, these performative acts depict sort of this kind of performativity occur in ritualized sword duels that occur throughout the show. So Shoujo Kakume Utena, or Revolutionary Girl Utena, aired on TV Tokyo in 1997. It's about the titular character Utena Tenjo, pictured on the right, who attends Otori Academy, where various students vie for betrothal rights, or perhaps more accurately, ownership of Anthy Himemiya, pictured on the left. Anthe is known as the Rose Bride and ultimately holds the, quote, power to bring the world revolution, end quote. This mysterious power is what the students fight over in stylized duels on a hidden arena on campus. Utena becomes Anthony's betrothed, almost accidentally at first, but soon fights to protect her in these ritualistic duels throughout the series. And throughout the series, they also subtly but surely fall in love with each other. So the duels in Utena are sites of performance. Each duelist wears a rose on their chest, and the object of the duel is to destroy the other duelist's rose with their swords. So this sort of the symbolic happenings here is not lost certainly for Ikuhara. While the duel certainly tests the physical limits of each duelist, it's rarely ever about their actual skill in combat. Rather, at the end of the series' first arc, it's revealed that each duel is ultimately won not just through swordsmanship, but through self-actualization and a greater commitment to and understanding of certain values: friendship, choice, reason, love, adoration, conviction, and self. Each duelist performs this kind of emotional labor, this emotional turmoil in each duel within this system that is ceremoniously reiterated and repeated throughout the series. These ritualized acts form as a key critique of heteronormative gender performativity, which I'll talk in more depth in a bit. These sword duels are also central to the series, or sort of the centerpiece of every episode, and they also serve as a key inspiration for Steven Universe's own ritualized performances called fusions. So in Steven Universe, fusions are these others' act of performance. It is when two or more gems come together and fuse to become another entity entirely. And this is an ability that only gems have in this series. Fusions, much like these duels, serve as performances of emotion and a physical manifestation of characters' sort of emotions, personality, their relationship to each other, etc. So gems usually dance in sync with each other to perform this kind of fusion, though sometimes it also just emerges from emotionally cathartic moments. As a process of becoming, fusion exceeds traditional categories and terminology around bodies, and is described in the show as an experience of forming something entirely new. And this sense of forming something entirely new is an apt way to describe how Steven Universe channels its anime influences. These influences that pervade the series are not necessarily over-deterministic in how its queerness manifests, but rather Steven Universe takes them as a generative jumping-off point to make something new and innovative in terms of queer representation. So both the duels in Utena and the fusions in Steven Universe are these performative acts that are shaped and constrained by strict codes of conduct. Otori Academy represents the larger system of patriarchy, how we are inculcated into its ideology from a young age, and how patriarchal and heteronormative ideologies oppress everyone through strict and oppressive gender roles. One example is how at the academy, Utena is chastised for the uniform that she wears. She wears her own unique uniform, which is black with the red shorts, but in the very first episode, the teacher chastised her for wearing a male uniform. When in fact, she's not wearing either the male or the female uniform, she's wearing her own uniform. But anything seen as not female is automatically assumed to be male. So we see the totalizing nature of the gender binary happening there. So both in the duels and then at the larger academy itself, there's a strict regulation of bodies, of gender performativity, and gender expression. In Steven Universe, Homeworld, again the gem empire colonizing planets across the galaxy, views this performative act of fusion quite differently than how the crystal gems do. Fusion for Homeworld is for practical use only. It's performed by gems of the same type only, usually just to accrue more power. Gems of different types, and we could read class as well as race here, are then not allowed to fuse. It's forbidden. The crystal gems reject this kind of ideology, instead embracing all kinds of fusion. And in this place of Homeworld, they try to form a more welcoming and accepting community on Earth. So both series then sort of grapple with these toxic hegemonies that seek to police bodies and gender expression, and illustrate these hegemonies and their transgression through these kinds of performative acts. For the sake of time, I'll just gesture to Judith Butler's work as a way to think through, again, performativity. It's also important to note that while Steven Universe is taking inspiration from these sword duels as these sites of performance, the show does not actually take the aesthetics of movement that is happening in Revolutionary Girl Utena. Throughout Ikuhara's works, there is a repetition of animated sequences, so be it they be transformation sequences or something similar. This is not done just to save the animation studio money, though that certainly helps, but in particular, it's often done to illustrate something on a symbolic level, not just on the narrative level. And in particular, Ikuhara uses this kind of repetition of animation as a means to get us to think about the gendered rituals of everyday life. He's very sort of cognizant about rituals. So Steven Universe certainly takes the pageantry and the performativity of these moments, but animates them much more in the tradition of American television animation, where there's an emphasis on unique character movement. How these series then grapple with these hegemonic systems is illustrative of the generative changes Steven Universe adds to its queer representation. At the end of Revolutionary Girl Utena, Anthe and Utena walk away from such hegemonies altogether. At the end of the series, Anthe leaves Otoye Academy in search of Utena, who is lost in the final duel. In the film adaptation Adolescence of Utena from 1999, it ends even more triumphantly with Utena and Anthe embracing and kissing each other naked as they ride into a bright, undiscovered future. Quite literally the manifestation of queer futurity that Jose Esteban Munoz writes of, the, quote, warm illumination of a horizon imbued with potentiality, end quote. So while Revolutionary Girls Utena's endings might seem a touch idealistic, as it focuses much more on the liberation of the mind first and foremost, and doesn't really discuss as much material forms of liberation, its desire for a radical alternative future is inspiring, and Steven Universe certainly channels that kind of inspiration and begins to actually sort of envision what that queer future would look like. So Steven Universe's version of queer futurity proposes an ethics of community that welcomes everyone who would be considered outcasts, from political rebels of homeworld to those who are seen as off-color to unacceptable fusions. Steven Universe envisions Earth as a place for putting into practice the ideal radical future that Ikuhara begins to gesture towards at the end of Revolutionary Girl Utena. And so the transformations in Steven Universe, not just fusions, but also the bodily transformations that occur throughout the show, as gems have the power to shape and manifest their bodies at will. These kinds of transformation literalize the fluidity of bodies, that our bodies are not static things, but they are actually in flux and change, and also illustrate, again, that gender is a social construct, that how we actually can express our gender is not set from birth, but you have abilities to change that. So the ability of transformation is a particular strength of animation, which has immense potential as a powerfully queer art form, burgeoning with the promise and possibilities of transformation and world-building that Munoz's queer futurity discusses. Animation in its limitless possible forms highlights its potential, and Steven Universe, this kind of limitless form, is supported and even encouraged through the production process, and being very supportive of what we call off-model drawings. There's a fluidity of expression here, particularly emotional expression, in shaping bodies at will, and that's valued in the production process. So in the production process itself, there's this recognition that bodies are not fixed, and that this kind of fluidity is encouraged. So Steven Universe's recognition of the shifting borders of embodiment can produce greater transformational change in a world shaped by heteronormative social relations. So both of these series then seek to dismantle oppressive structures of gender, presenting nuanced understandings of embodiment and the performative codes of gender and sexuality, especially those that manifest in everyday life. Steven Universe, much like Revolutionary Girl Utena before it, envisions queer futures where hierarchies of body, race, class, gender, etc. are destabilized and abandoned and destroyed altogether. In this way, much of Steven Universe's progressive potential draws directly from Ikuhara's work and builds from it. And so it's this kind of cross-cultural exchange around queer representation that really fascinates me, and it also highlights how anime's influence is manifesting in American animation today. Transnational animation production, circulation, and reception is shaping the American animation industry both aesthetically and narratively. American animated TV shows like Avatar: The Last Airbender and its sequel, Legend of Korra, directly incorporate anime aesthetics into their shows. So they're often said to look like anime. They have sort of the typical big anime eyes, etc. Steven Universe is interesting in that it remains remarkably cartoony in its aesthetics. It doesn't look like anime, but instead it takes these particular themes and these particular motifs from Sailor Moon and Revolutionary Girl Utena, among others. And this is precisely also in part because the staff of the show, which are collectively known as the Kruniverse, are fans of these series and anime in general. So fandom serves as an important link for how anime manifests, its influences manifest in the series. Rebecca Sugar has been open in interviews and other written material that she is a fan, identifies as a fan, knows the circuits of fandom well. And we see how the crew's fandom manifests in the series through these kinds of references to other anime. So this shot, for instance, is a reference to the infamous final scene of Hideaki Anno's End of Evangelion. In short, the Kruniverse are members of the animation industry. Yes, they're these working professionals, but they're also fans, know the circuits of fandom, and participate in that fandom, which is a very interesting positionality. And so, but it's also not just the Kruniverse who are fans. So Ikuhara himself also participates in fan culture, such as cosplay, particularly gender-bending cosplay. So this is him as Sailor Mars from Sailor Moon. And so also notable is that part of the inspiration for Revolutionary Girl Utena was the anime that Ikuhara was a big fan of, The Rose of Versailles, which aired in 1979 to 1980, which is a story of Lady Oscar, a woman raised as a man. And so you can actually trace this kind of genealogy from Rose of Versailles to Steven Universe, and which really helps illustrate the impact that the transnational flow and circulation of anime has in terms of the production processes and the creation of queer representation over time. And so one of the easiest ways to, again, trace that genealogy of fandom is through the motif of the rose, which is prominent throughout each animated series. Fandom then forms a lens through which queerness is transferred and transformed in each iteration. You can also see fandom manifest in Steven Universe itself. The series situates Steven and other characters as fans, as avid consumers of pop culture. Steven, for instance, owns his own copy of Sailor Moon Tankobon. Steven also participates in fan creation, for example, filming a reaction video for one of his favorite shows, Crying Breakfast Friends. Outside of the series, Sugar and the entire crew are very supportive and actively encouraging of fan works. They'll often post fan art on Twitter or Instagram of other shows that they like. Transnational fandom then serves as this powerful connector between animators and audiences, bringing them together to celebrate new forms of embodiment made possible by animation. So both Ikuhara and Sugar envision radical queer futures as a means of escape from an alternative to toxic gender norms. Much like Utena and Anthe leave Otori Academy, the Crystal Gems have escaped to Earth searching for a better place for queer desire and imagination, and also fight to protect that future as well. The Crystal Gems are an intergalactic family of outcasts, queer people, aliens, and children. It is only fitting then that Steven Universe also produces a family, one that is transnational and full of fans, queer people, allies, and animators, all yearning towards a queer future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we'll open the floor to questions. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you so much. I'm interested in the transnational circulation of such texts that you mentioned and that show anime as a very unstable, or could show anime as an unstable text. So I was wondering if you could say something about the censorship that was very heavy. I'm thinking from my personal experience with Sailor Moon or what we call the Lady Oscar.
Yeah.
Was heavily censored by Mediaset, was the Italian Berlusconi's channel who imported those texts, targeting them to children, which was not exactly the original aim of them. And I was wondering if you could say something, if you know or if you're interested about censorship involving sex change or nudity or other example that involve the body, which you show is very important.
Yeah, so I guess to start with, Sailor Moon was sort of infamously, when it was first sort of ported over in the 90s, it was infamously adapted to make Haruka and I forget the other sailor. It's like Neptune and Uranus, I think. The two Sailor Scouts who are in love. They're lesbians. They were censored to be cousins in the first adaptation when it came over to the United States. In the English dub. And so what's actually happened is when the show's been now re-released with a new dub, all of that has sort of been fixed up, and the original, the censorship has been removed. What's interesting about Sailor Moon is, from what I understand, is that Ikuhara did leave the show. He directed about sort of like the middle portion of the show, as well as the movie Sailor Moon R. But that he left the show because I think he wanted it to be even more like explicitly queer in some ways, but that Toei Studios wasn't really having it, so he went to make his own show with revolutionary girl Utena. What's interesting about Utena is a lot of the queerness is it's very subtle, I guess I could say in some ways, except in like the ending sequences, like credit ending sequences, it's more explicit. So you never see like Utena and Anthy kiss in the television series, but the series was a big hit, so it spawned a movie, and obviously you see them kiss multiple times, and it's much more explicit in terms of the queerness there, and that you actually do see them kiss. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
All right, other questions?
Yeah. Is that okay?
Go ahead.
But what kind of parallel would you draw between, for example, Goku and Gohan fusing in more mainstream heteronormative way versus those girls do in this show?
Yeah, I do know that. So like Dragon Ball Z fusion is part of the influence in also creating these fusions, just in terms of like there's certain kind of gestures that need to be done and then they fuse. I haven't watched a lot of Dragon Ball Z, so I don't know about it as much. My colleague Kevin Cooley at University of Florida has written a bit more about that, and that's forthcoming. But I think it is another example of, it's not just sort of a copying of what they see in anime, but it's sort of making something new and making it explicitly queer. In terms of gender, also sort of important to note that gems themselves, they're sort of these genderless beings, in the sense that literally in the show, they're these rocks from space that can sort of just project bodies from hard light. But they all use she, her pronouns, so in a sense, the way we receive them and the way they sort of express themselves in terms of gender in the show would be female. Yeah.
Because I find it interesting because it's really similar in Dragon Ball, but it's the earring that symbolizes the fusion. So I don't know, just
Anyone else? Yes.
Okay. Thank you for your presentation. That brings me something something huge, is like the ontological way of animation beyond anime, to be able to shape bodies and to create transformation, and it can open a way to having this analysis of movies and have various type of analysis on the movies, thanks to the possibilities of animation to create this these kind of transformations. And I would like to know if you have think about American animations, very traditional narratives, but thanks to this power the animation has, as you said it, we may have alternative way to think about the movies.
So thinking about like what are like queer aesthetics of animation in American animation, maybe.
Yeah.
Is that what you're thinking? Yeah. There hasn't been. What's interesting is there hasn't been a lot of work on queer animation, or like the intersections of animation and like LGBTQ themes. That's something some of my colleagues and I are trying to rectify. so it's sort of tricky for like a case by case basis. Like what are the circumstances of production? Like for Ikuhara, he is kind of like almost like this auteur in that he has a very specific style in terms of the repetition of images and how images move. What's interesting, the difference between, at least in terms of tendencies between American animation, especially like Disney and Japanese animation for television is, well, there's an emphasis on movement into depth, not as much for the TV stuff, but that's more for the films and like in Disney stuff or American stuff. And also character movement. So like fluidity of like character movement is something that's highly valued. Whereas in Japan, there's actually much more tendency to move background images, or the movement that's created is that maybe the person's standing still, but the image, the actual cell is slid. And so that's how you instill a kind of movement. So those are the kind of tendencies that are happening there. So with Ikuhara, we see that's the kind of movement that he's really interested in, and also like the repetition of these certain sequences every episode, like transformation sequences. For American animation, it tends to be much more the fluidity of like an expression. So I guess I'm thinking sort of like Tuca and Birdie, which is like the new Netflix show that just came out. Really great, just finished it. A lot of characters are like lesbians in that show. Like there are just a lot of sort of secondary characters or background characters who are just these lesbian couples. And what you see a bit more in that show, I guess you could say, Lisa Hannibal is sort of the main creator of that show, is this emphasis of bodies. Bodies are weird. Bodies do things that are sort of strange and unnatural. So bodies are kind of doing weird and unnatural things all the time. So in the second episode, someone's breast actually jumps off of their body because they're like, I'm done with this, I'll see you later. So that's the kind of thing where it's like Lisa Hannibal has a specific sort of style of bodies are weird and can do weird things, so let's just do that in animation. Yeah.
Okay, we have time for two more, so we can go first.
Thank you for talking about Tuca and Birdie, because I tried to watch the first episode and it was so intense I couldn't finish it. So maybe I'll give it another try if you can take it. But my question was actually about what do you think of the ideas of queer reboots, like She-Ra, for example? I'm thinking of. It took something very heteronormative and very heteronormative, and kind of like they rebooted it with a totally different crew and.
What's interesting about She-Ra is I think what's happening in the series. It's very the newer series for Netflix is very much more sort of explicitly queer, which is really great. I haven't seen the second season, but I know there's some gay dads, I believe, which sounds really excellent. What's interesting about the original She-Ra, but also especially the original He-Man, is there were like gay people who were animators on that show, and the shows, like the original shows, I don't know as much about She-Ra, but He-Man was very gay. It was a very gay show. Like it's mostly like these big muscular guys with no shirts on.
It's a gladiator.
Yeah, exactly. So I think in some ways, I wonder if Noelle Stevenson and the creators are picking up on the queer subtext, but just making it text, and like just make it more explicit in a way, and sort of update it. That's not just maybe sort of the masculine centric gayness, but more LGBTQ broader. Yeah.
You had a question? Yeah.
I was wondering how does Ikuhara's work and sort of the other things you talked about work within the context of the Japanese animation, because I think I hear a lot about these specific things that are very queer and then sort of other very popular stuff that's not queer at all. In my opinion, maybe it is, I don't know. But I was wondering like how it sort of fits into that. Is there other sort of female loving female or women loving women representation, but it's just not very good, or does it not exist at all?
Yeah, I guess two things to note is so there is like the sort of genre of yuri, which is female love, in Japanese media or like anime and manga. It can be tricky. I mean, it can sort of depend on what franchise you're looking at, because a lot of yuri, it might be heavily implied, and the idea is like there's always the out of disavowal that's like, no, they're just friends or something. No, it's like, even though it's like, oh, well, don't you see how they touch each other in a certain way? Don't you see this? But it's like, but you always sort of have an out of disavowal. And that's sort of connected to one of Ikuhara's sort of main things when thinking about queerness in his shows is that in Japan, at least, the issue or some of the pressures that queer people face is it's that issue of invisibility, particularly just invisibility and erasure. And so Utena is sort of about that, especially Yurikuma Arashi is about that, though Yurikuma Arashi is also a little more explicit about what is the violence that queer people can face, but also how are queer people like either seen as predatory or they're like there are unjust stereotypes that are placed upon queer people. So there are other gay works in anime that are outside Ikuhara. I find his work in specific is especially interested in the invisibility of queer people. How do you raise visibility? Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, and we'll call our next speaker to come to the phone.
Thank you.